So with that, I just want to say a few words on the context of the Landscape Decisions program and where we are in the program. After more than 4 years of work on this, in over 70 projects all across the UK, there's been an awful lot of work going on in many organizations, including research institutes, including in policy departments, in the devolved administrations, in central government, in the universities that are involved. And most of the people here who I know are part of the program have made a huge contribution to its success. So we are at a turning point, I think, in how we manage our landscapes. After leaving the European Union, the Common Agricultural Policy doesn't apply anymore to the UK. And hence there were all sorts of policy developments going on to replace that. Part of that, there is a land use framework for England being developed in DEFRA. And there are similar policy instruments developed in the devolved administrations. But there are still big questions around how we deliver on the Environmental Improvement Plan and the DEFRA 25-year environment plan in a way that meets not just one of the objectives, but all of the objectives of that plan simultaneously. We have to think about landscapes from a multifunctional lens, and we have to think about how we achieve different objectives with a single intervention, which is not always straightforward. One of the big learning points for me in the program actually was to engage with a diversity of different disciplines. And I've learned a lot about how we can use the arts in actually engaging with people to understand landscapes and how people feel about landscapes. I've learned about how we can capture the values that people hold about the landscapes that they live in, and how we can use that potentially to engage more people in the decision-making processes at the local scale. And I think one of the challenges we still have is actually to bridge some of those disciplines. We've come a long way. In the program, we have had meetings where mathematicians were talking to artists, to social scientists, and to modelers. And out of that, there was a huge range of activities coming out where we've seen the science and the research in the landscapes domain advance significantly. But also we have had disciplinary advances inside those disciplines coming out. And it's been great to be able to follow all this from the program coordination team perspective. I've seen a lot of interesting stuff pass my desk. I'm really grateful for all the work you've all been doing. And I look forward to the next 2 days to hear even more about it. We have a range of activities planned, and I hope you find them all attractive. We have some exhibitions, we have some demonstrations with TV screens of digital content. We also have a poetry reading planned, and we have some research talks in the plenary today. All the talks today will happen in this room. Tomorrow we have more talks than we could fit into one single session, so we have parallel sessions going on, and these will be upstairs in the meeting rooms. So, long story short, looking forward to the event, and I want to thank the Royal Society for making the venue available to us. I want to thank all the members of the program coordination team for helping organize the conference, and I want to thank the staff from the University of Leicester particularly who have made a contribution to making this happen and worked their socks off to get this all organized in time. I would like to then hand over to the first pull factor in getting people into this room, which is our first keynote speaker, Sir Charles Godfray from the University of Oxford, who has done some agenda-setting work around landscapes. And Sir Charles, please do come up to the stage.
Thanks very much, Heiko. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks everyone for getting up early to come to the first talk. And there's the first slide. I noticed that Heiko has asked me to talk about science and not to tell you some of my poetry, so I'm sorry that he didn't invite me for that, but you should be very glad. So what I'm going to do in this talk is to do 3 things. The first is very much agenda setting and look at what I think are some of the main factors that are going to impinge on land use decisions, largely in this country, over the next couple of decades. I then want to explore some of what I think are the guiding principles that should help us in coming to these decisions. And in doing that, I'm going to draw very heavily on a report that the Royal Society produced last year on multifunctional landscapes. And then in the final part, I'm going to talk about what it might mean on the ground. And this is a more personal view of how land use decision, how land use in this country might evolve over the next 10 or 20 years. And I'm going to be largely talking about the UK, but I think many of the things that we discuss in this country have relevance to other countries. And in fact, the two slides I put up there are from New Zealand, partly because I always feel embarrassed talking about land use, whereas me and my family in this country have no real connections with the land. But my mother is a farmer's daughter, grew up in New Zealand in one of the most beautiful farms in the world between the Pacifics and the Kaikoura Mountains. And when she grew up, the farm produced butter that was made in the factory below that was then sent to the UK. And it's part of the globalization, how things have changed over the years, that the factory is now a bijou hotel with eye-watering room rates, and the farm produces milk solids that goes to China and East Asia. So what are the main drivers that are going to be affecting land use over the next couple of years? My sort of day job is as a population biologist, and it may be that because of that, I always start off with population, and also the good news on population. That population growth rate is decelerating. It will almost certainly plateau this century. It comes with all sorts of demographic adjustment problems, but it is still, in my view, extraordinarily good news. I intellectually grew up in the 70s or 80s, in the time of the population bomb, the Club of Rome, where there was not, I think, a well-understood intellectual argument against Malthus. Malthus, remember, who said that inevitably population growth would outpace our ability to feed global populations. It now looks like there is a possibility of a soft landing. I say to my students that in my early 60s, I'm more optimistic than when I was their age. Now, of course, one of the reasons that population is going down, it's a very good reason, is people are coming out of poverty. You bring people out of poverty, and they demand better diets and more food, and that's wholly good. But if you try and look at global demand for food increasing this century, and there's a meta-analysis of this published recently, it's probably going to be 30 to 60% by mid-century. Now, that's a lot more food to produce, but it is still doable. To me, to be colloquial, it's really game on in this. This is something that we can address. And an interesting question is, what should the UK's response be to this 30 to 60% increase in food demand this century? And you could argue it many different ways. You could argue we should, as a highly sophisticated scientific country with a great agricultural industry, we should produce at least 30 to 60% more food to play our part in meeting that challenge. You could argue the opposite. You could argue that we're one of the most biodiversity depauperate countries in the world. We should de-intensify some of our agriculture in order to make space for nature. The government has actually said we should maintain the status quo, our current production of food. You'll recall Henry Dimbleby did the National Food Strategy nearly 2 years ago. And the government's response to that, it didn't really do, the response was, in my opinion, a bit disappointing. I mean, one of the interesting things it did say was that for the first time, as far as I'm aware, it did say a target on what our food production should be. So that's one of the boundary conditions, the global demand for food. And food food prices and food demand is very much determined by global processes. And I'll argue at the end that we can actually both produce more food and actually increase biodiversity and other functions from the land. I don't need to say a lot about climate change. Everyone here, I'm sure, is aware of its increasing policy prominence. And there's increasing focus on food farming and land use. And the Landscape Decision Programme has done some really interesting work in this area. We know that peatlands are an extraordinary, if managed badly, are an extraordinary source of CO2. We're doing major changes in this country and elsewhere to try and reduce emissions from dried out peatlands. We know that livestock is the single greatest food type that contributes to global warming. It's complicated. Methane is not the same as carbon dioxide. We can discuss that if you're interested. But we're not going to get to net zero unless we, unless we have some serious discussions about diet change and meat and livestock. I think it's interesting that so many companies, especially in the food sector, have now made commitments about making net zero by different periods of time, typically 2030, 2040, and 2050. And these companies are now looking at how they can actually achieve this. And obviously, they start off with their direct emissions and how they buy their energy in the jargon, the Scope 1 and Scope 2. And that gets them so far, but nowhere near meeting the commitments that they've made. And then they begin to look at the Scope 3, the emissions that come downstream from their activities or upstream from their activities. And many food sector companies are saying, well, it is really livestock that is the thing that they're going to be able to deal with first of all. And so irrespective of what government policy is, we may see real pressure on landscape by changing demand for food types, especially around livestock. And this is probably going to happen anyway, and it's going to have social as well as economic and biophysical effects. And we need to think that through, and in particular, if it's going to be successful, think how a transition can be a just transition. And then the very most optimistic scenarios about what we can do with net zero require some negative emissions. We need to get carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. How are we going to do that? Well, maybe in the future we're going to have carbon capture, direct air carbon capture. We should be researching this. We should be trying to work out how to do it. But one should not be betting the farm on it. At the moment, the only negative emissions strategies that we have that work at scale essentially involve photosynthesis and other land use effects. So the increasing importance of negative emissions is going to have a major effect on land use and land use policy. We're at a time of really interesting technological opportunities and challenges. Both political parties, rightly in my view, keep stressing productivity and the need to increase the outputs of the wide range of goods that we do. Well, increase the efficiency with which we produce those outputs. I worry sometimes that the environmental and the economic arguments get separated. They're part of the same program. We need to think about them both. And we live in a country that has a really good science track record. We're really good in innovation, perhaps slightly less good at translation, but we're really good at innovation. And we should be applying the narrative that we see around AI, gaming, life sciences to agricultural innovation as well. But the traditional goal of agricultural research, which is purely being to increase yields, needs to evolve and change. So that sustainability is as important as increasing yields, as getting the environmental goods as well. And of course, these are more complicated because they don't produce necessarily a direct income stream. So again, it goes back to how does one set up the market, how does one set the regulatory environment such that research on sustainability is encouraged. And now I've talked a bit about Scope 3 and livestock and meat and livestock, meat and dairy and things. There is a huge amount of investment going into meat and dairy substitutes at the moment. And I'm not saying it's going to happen, but there is a possibility of substantial disruption in this area. I guess if I was a betting person, I'd say that within 10 years, most of the meat that goes into processed products, the patties, the sausages and things like that, is likely to come from non-traditional sources. And there are some groups who are far more advanced in what they think the rate of change may be. So I'm not saying it will happen, but again, thinking about land use into the future, thinking about the livelihoods of people who depend on the land, we have to think about that. Biodiversity. has become increasingly more important in the political discourse. And there are two aspects of biodiversity: the ecosystem, services, natural capital, the things that we rely on nature to do. And this is the way one argues for biodiversity if one's talking to someone from Treasury and things. But in the public discourse, the stewardship aspect of biodiversity is equally important. And I call it new romantics, which, just having seen what I write, it looks a bit sneering. I really don't mean it as sneering. I'm talking about people like James Rebank, Guy Shrubshaw and things, who are writing, I think, wonderful, elegiac pieces about what we've lost with biodiversity, what we can recreate. And I think this is going to become an increasingly important political factor in thinking ahead. Then we have geopolitical challenges. We've been through a really extraordinary 4 years, both of the pandemic and then a war in Europe. At the bottom, you can see some of the volatility in fertilizer prices caused by trade sanctions on Russia and Belarus in particular. Now, having said that, if you were to have asked me in February 2020 how the global food system would have responded both to the pandemic and to the war in Ukraine, I would have been far more pessimistic than how it has actually turned out. I think there is some good news there that there is more resilience in the global food system than perhaps we expected beforehand. Having said that, one clearly doesn't want to be guilty of complacency. And one of the things I do worry about is we have to have a globalized food system if we're going to feed a global population. If you don't believe that, then talk to the agricultural minister of Egypt, for example, a country with 100 million people, 150 by the end of this century, with very little agricultural land. We have to have an globalized agricultural system. Very influenced by Joe Stiglitz, the economist in this, who said, we have globalization, get over it. The real challenge is how does one make globalization work in favor of people who do not have the power? And I worry about the retreat from globalization that we're seeing with some of the trade disputes, for example, between America and China, will have serious effects on the food system. You can build a semiconductor factory, a fab. You can move it from Beijing to America. You cannot move a large bread basket. We have to maintain the ability to source food from multiple bread baskets. And then, as Heike mentioned right at the beginning, this is a curious time for the UK. We came out of the European Union, like it or not. We came out of CAP. We have the opportunity for redesignating the way we contribute. We contribute about £3 billion a year. The money that used to go in CAP, that goes in different ways into the rural economy. There is a way of doing that better. The CAP had to... The CAP is a system of rules that had to work equally from the Peloponnese to Lapland, whereas we have the opportunity of producing a system that is more bespoke, that works much better for a smaller geographical area. And then the other big political theme, I think, of the moment, and perhaps it's gone down a bit wrongly, is levelling up. And when one thinks about levelling up, one immediately thinks of coastal cities, industrial cities, cities which have missed out on some of the recent economic boom elsewhere in the country. But we must remember that there is a rural agricultural precariat. And I think this is DEFRA figures. 42% of farms in the UK would be insolvent if we took away the single farm payment. So those are a few of the drivers that I think will be affecting land use going into the future. It's not exclusive. I'm sure you can think of others, but those are the things that I think are probably the most important. So as I said, I chaired the writing group of Royal Society report on multifunctional landscapes that came out last year. And in the Royal Society, we don't promulgate particular policies and things like that, but we try and argue about how science, both natural science and the social science, can help and resolve some of these policy issues. And we explore a number of things in the report, but what I'm going to concentrate on now is a few of what we thought were guiding principles going ahead. Now, the first thing we argued in favour of was something that has been government policy, although it's not talked about now as much as it used to be. And this is the mantra, public money for public goods. So the money that used to come via CAP in the single farm payment, which was essentially it was more complicated than this, but is an area-based cash transfer, that this should evolve over time without any cliff edges into paying for the provision of public goods. And I put up there a paper that came out of DEFRA in February 2018 when Michael Gove was Secretary of State, with the extraordinary title, Health and Harmony, which doesn't really relate to anything it says. But apart from that, I thought it was one of the most important papers that has come out of DEFRA or math since the Second World War. And it basically talked about public money for public good and began to say how that might happen in the future. Now, why I think this is important is I want to keep that £3 billion a year going into the rural economy. And I think in order to do that, one needs to have a bona fide economic argument for that. And I think the mantra, public money for public good, those of you who are economists will know quite what's behind that, gives you that. But there's also a pragmatic justification as well. Without that economic argument, it is far more likely that that gets taken away and given to many of the other things that government has to deal with. Of course, this does beg the question of defining what a public good is. And there's not time to go into this, but let me just give one example of one of the arguments around that. And is food production a public good? Now, Neil Parish, who resigned from Parliament after a mini-scandal, asked the Prime Minister at the time, Theresa May, does my right honourable friend agree that supporting food production in this country is a public good? Now, it's not a public good. It's good for the public, obviously food, but it's not a public good in the technical economic sense. And May, to give her full credit, essentially said that in her reply and saying it's good for the public. So I worry about the adoption of the term public good for sectoral interests. I think there are elements of food security that are public goods, and I look at resilience more than self-sufficiency and production. And although the narrative of market failures can be exaggerated, I think it's worthwhile thinking where the market is producing things that undermine resilience. And just the argument against self-sufficiency that my colleague at Oxford, Dieter Helmer, always makes is that if you think self-sufficiency is food security, then you should be talking about self-sufficiency of inputs, such as fertilizers, such as agrochemicals as well. So the second thing that we try to argue is all land must be productive. And of course, people will see that immediately and say, oh, you're trying to convert everything into farmland. And we don't mean that. And we mean all land must produce something, and that something might be food or fuel or fibre, but it might also be land for biodiversity. It might also be many of the other ecosystem services. So the argument is we do not have the luxury in a small island such as this to have any land that is not productive in some way when one defines productivity to include both the provision of private goods and public goods. And again, I'll say little about it because I know there'll be so much more in the next 2 days. But to try and explore some of these issues is where science is really important, where we have to understand the synergies and the trade-offs. In the report, we complement the work that was being done in the landscape decision programme and talk about some of the opportunities for better data and analytics. And then Heiko alluded to this, and this is just so important. This is not just a simple scientific natural science issue. There's a huge amount of social science, and rightfully in a democracy, small p politics in this. One can see the narratives about what it means to be a farmer. I'm old enough to remember where on wet days when we couldn't do sports, we were dragooned at school into halls and shown films from the Ministry of Agriculture about the noble farmer feeding the country, as he or she did during the Second World War. Heroic efforts from the agricultural industry in those days. But that led to, I think, what was rather a narrow narrative of what it meant to be a farmer, focused purely on food production and private goods. And this is changing. You probably can't see it, but that's on the bottom right is the Brecklands Farmers Wildlife Network, which is a wonderful consortium of farmers who are both producing food but also producing very high-quality habitat for biodiversity. So those are some of the things that we said in the Multifunctional Landscape report. It's free on the web, so if you're interested, please do look at it. So finally, what might it mean on the ground? And now I'm going to move to sort of a more personal view of, I think, the way forward. And in particular, what it would mean for today's farmland. Now, if one thinks of a landscape or a system of landscapes as complex as that in the British Isles, let alone before you go abroad, it's simplistic to try and say, well, we have farmland versus non-farmland, we have high-intensity farmland versus medium-intensity. It's much, much more complicated than that. But having said that, I think it is still helpful conceptually to think about landscapes in a three-compartment model. And interestingly, Henry Dimbleby in the food strategy also talked about this. And again, stressing it's a continuum, then you can think of land that is chiefly managed for sustainable food production, land which is explicitly managed for multiple outputs, and land chiefly managed for non-food outputs. And I think there's a growing evidence base arguing that this is helpful. So we're talking about multifunctional landscapes, but there is a difference in the degree to which land is multifunctional. So we definitely need multifunctional landscapes, and in some places, functions will be more separated. In other places, it will be brought more together. So let me just sketch out what this might look like. So land chiefly managed for sustainable food production. Now again, many of my friends in the environmental community sort of very worry about that and see purely increasing food production and do not see sustainability. And I understand that concern because often sustainability is lip services paid to sustainability. So I think we need genuinely sustainable, high-yielding agriculture. I like the phrase sustainable intensification, though I know many people dislike it. We have tools in which we can bring that apart based around polluter pays and things like that. Such high-yielding land, high-yielding sustainably land, is highly knowledge-intensive. This is where the wonderful science that this country produces comes in. But it's just not the technological aspects to that, it's also the ecological aspects to that. Regenerative agriculture, which is a slippery term to try and work out what it means, but it includes a whole load of really interesting ideas and innovations. So, regenerative agriculture can contribute to productivity in high-yielding land as much as lower-yielding farmland. There will be no regret synergies that you can do. Simple changes to how you manage farmland over the winter can make a huge difference, for example, to overwintering birds. And then in this type of land, there would be relatively little money going into it from the public purse. This would be land that might produce some public goods, but it would largely be concentrating on producing private goods. Then we have land chiefly managed for multiple outputs. And here we accept that there is going to be a reduction in yield, which we accept because it is producing other functions. And we're being honest about trade-offs. There really are trade-offs. You cannot produce as high-yielding outputs using purely organic and systems such as that. So one needs to be honest about outputs and honest about the benefits that one can get from having land that is managed with lower yields but producing other outputs. This is just as highly knowledge-intensive as the high-yielding land. There will be technology that is required for this, including some of the precision agriculture that you tend to think of as just applied to high-yielding land, but can be as important environmental when one's producing environmental goods as well as many agroecological techniques as well. This is where the public money for public goods comes in. The yields that are foregone because they are producing beneficial ecosystem services attract payments from public goods. And again, much of the biodiversity that we privilege in this country, which might not have existed or might not have existed in great quantities before humanity, is farmland biodiversity. And this is the issue of what actually is our baseline, what biodiversity do we want to get? But quite a lot of the biodiversity we want is actually associated with farmland, and especially farmland that is managed in ways that is beneficial to biodiversity. And it's in this central area, I think, where all the progress has been made in the organic movement, much of the regenerative movement, agroecological movement, much of that is really important. And then we have land that is managed for non-food outputs. So at the moment, only 3% of land is under semi-natural habitats. And I know people worry about arguments for rewilding, thinking that we're going to see vast swathes of the countryside return to scrub and forest. And not helped, I have to say, by some proponents for rewilding who I think rather glibly say things like, let's rewild Wales, because productivity is low there. But there is really important benefits that can be got for taking some land out of agriculture, woodland for net zero. I've already talked about peatland. And there is a really big chunk of biodiversity that is not farmland biodiversity, that really does not exist in farmland and needs land to be explicitly devoted to supporting it. Again, this is seen throughout the three different types I was talking about. This is really highly knowledge intensive. Taking land out of agriculture obviously requires skills if you're sort of turning it into, if you're trying to regenerate peatland or you're trying to maximize carbon. But rewilding isn't just letting nature take its course. Go to NEP, you can see that it's very much guided in how you get there. So there are real research needs there as well. And there's some really interesting analysis from the Green Alliance led by Dustin Benefit, showing that if this is done properly, then it can be done in a way that retains farmers on the lands and pays them a proper return and actually increases rural employment rather than leading, as many in the agricultural industry worry that it'll lead to fewer jobs in the countryside. Biofuels might come in here. In my view, I suspect not, but I just put it in there because we don't have time to talk about it, but just to mention it. How do we get there? Well, I've already talked about culture change. Being a farmer, being a landowner, that needs to be different. We desperately need a land use framework. Many of the commitments this government has made and previous governments have made, many of which are wholly, in my view, admirable, don't really add up. And we did a back-of-the-envelope calculation in the Royal Society report trying to do that. So we need a land use framework to try and bring this together. And it's virtually there. We should see it in the next month or so. We need to see the evolution of ELMS. ELMS is the scheme that's going to replace the single farm payment. I have a huge sympathy for farmers who at the moment say we really don't know how elms is going to evolve more than 1 or 2 years in advance. We need a long-term plan so that farmers and other landowners can begin to make decisions and an investment now. And I'm going to say something hugely politically naive. This is something that it would be nice if we could try and take out of the political bear pit and get some cross-party consensus on, in a way that we've done to a certain extent with climate change. There's not a lot of votes in it. This is something that both parties, I think, could come to an agreement. And it needs political bravery and leadership. You mightn't like his politics, but I think Michael Gove showed political leadership and bravery. But it is too easy just to blame the politicians. We, each of us as individuals, also need to provide the public discourse that allows politicians to make these different decisions. I don't normally quote Jean-Claude Juncker, but he once said, often we politicians know what to do, but what we don't know is how to get re-elected once we've done it. So, to conclude, UK farming and land use faces unprecedented challenges, and maintaining the status quo is not an option. And also, if we take net zero seriously, we have to move fast. I think there are real opportunities to find common ground amongst all who care about farming and the environment. And I think the work that's been done in the Landscape Decision Programme will be helpful in providing the background upon which the political discussions, and it is a political issue, the political discussions and debate can take place on the basis of much better information and science. Thank you. Happy to. Are there any questions?
5 minutes for questions.
Gentleman in the pale jacket.
We have got some mics, if that's okay. I think it's going to be better if you do use the mics in view of the fact that you've got people online, etc. So hopefully that will be on. Thank you. Andrew Ross from Global Garden. The government has just changed the requirement for nutrient neutrality payments by developers into a long-term catchment-based strategy. That is exactly the political background that you are asking for. How can that be now incorporated into your proposals here?
So there are two components to that. One is thinking about catchment strategies. I think that's wholly good. Again, my colleague at Oxford, Dieter Helm, who used to chair the National Capital Committee, has advocated that for a long time. I worry particularly about the nutrient neutrality issue, and I noticed that the Office of Environmental Protection is looking at that, and I'll be very interested to see what Dame Glenys Stacey and her people come up with. Thank you for the question. Lady in the green top.
There we go, thank you. Jess Davis from Lancaster University. One of your points on how do we get there, the first one was culture change. I wonder whether you could expand a little bit on that, and being in the Royal Society today, I wondered what your thoughts were on the culture change needed in academia as well to deliver.
Great question. Say two things on that. One is just to repeat what I said about the culture change and what it means to be a farmer. You're right to challenge us at the Royal Society here. I mean, the British Academy is just across those steps over there, and we do not do enough with it. And there are moves ahead to do that. I should say that the multifunctional landscape report that I chaired for the Royal Society had several people from the social sciences on it as well. But yes, this is, no one in this room would think that there's a simple linear relationship between evidence going into policy. It's much, much more complicated than that. Boneheaded natural scientists such as me need smart social scientists to tell us how it actually works.
Brett.
Charles, that was a wonderful... Is this on again? Doesn't sound like it. It is. Oh, right. You can't hear when you're speaking, can you? As a wonderful summary of all the issues we're facing. One thing you didn't talk about, I think the two things I was interested in. One was related to the first questioner, talking about development and another use of the land, which we have great need for. And that relates to offset markets. Biodiversity Net Gain will be with us within just a matter of months. And this is another huge source of revenue that you haven't talked about, private money coming into nature-based projects. What are your thoughts on the possibilities for private financing of land use change and how that should be properly managed and the institutions we need to make that work to our advantage?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I did ask Heiko for 2 hours for my talk, but he only gave me 30 minutes. So I didn't talk about that really important thing. It's still a bit of the Wild West out there, which I worry about. I mean, biodiversity is so much harder than other things to get metrics on. You know, even carbon is to a certain extent fungible, like money is. So I'm really enthusiastic. I hope it will happen. I think there needs to be, well, to be honest, we need to learn by doing. I don't think it's just a question of doing academic research. But in developing these biodiversity markets and other environmental markets, we need to do it in such a way that they can adapt and change as we work out how things work in practice. Because especially when you get into markets, then there is such an incentive to reverse engineer and come out with strategies that make money but don't necessarily affect the environment. And one will only really discover what those are once one's kicked the tires with having something in actually happening. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that engaging discussion, and thank you, Sir Charles, for that really agenda-setting opening to the conference.